Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for being here. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Vitaly Chernetsky. I'm director here at the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Slavic Languages and Literature. And we are especially excited to welcome today's presenter, Alana Holland, who is a PhD candidate in the Department of History, coming to a very successful completion of her time at KU soon. We'll get there, and we're keeping fingers crossed that it's going to be a very, very successful completion indeed. I will let my colleague, Dr. Justina Bajnek, introduce Alana in a moment, but for now I just wanted to give a heads up about a couple of events that are coming up. And those are this Sunday will be the first day of March. And so we have our traditional event that always happens at the beginning of March, which is our Spring Festival, where we welcome indeed the beginning of spring. I'll just pass the flyer around. We actually have more copies in the office. I'll bring them. And the event happens off campus. It will be at the Carnegie Building, which is on 9th Street, not far from here. And it's a great opportunity to taste foods of the region, learn about cultures and celebrations, and just meet fun people and have a good time. Always is on Sunday afternoons, as it is in this case as well. So that is one event, and the other event I just wanted to give a heads up that next week we will not have our traditional Tuesday lunchtime Brownbag talk, but we will have a guest speaker on Wednesday at 3 p.m. in this very room. And this will be a guest from Ukraine. Stanislav Menzalevsky is the head of the research department at the Dovzhenko Center, which is Ukraine's National Film Archive. This academic year, he is a Fulbright researcher at the University of California, Berkeley. So he will be talking about 1920s in Ukraine, the so-called Ukrainian Hollywood period, where Ukraine actually was a very active producer of films and the biggest single studio in the then young Soviet Union was located in Ukraine, not in Russia. That is a period whose history was long suppressed, and it's now being rediscovered. A lot of the films that were considered lost have been recovered and restored, released with new soundtracks. So our guest will speak about this period, and then we'll introduce the screening of one of those films, which is In Springtime by Mikhail Kaufman, who, for those of you who are familiar with film history, he is the man with the movie camera. We can see in the movie Man with the Movie Camera by his brother Dziga Vertov, but also a very interesting director in his own right. So these are two upcoming events in early March. And in general, here is our events calendar sheet. Please grab a copy and follow us on social media. I think Facebook is the one most active. I think for some people perhaps Facebook is passé, but that's the one we've been most diligently updating. So please excuse us if we are not cool kids anymore. All right, now I will pass on to Justina to introduce our speaker.
Thank you. It is my great pleasure to introduce Alana Holland, who will be giving the Brownbag lecture today. Alana Holland is a fifth-year PhD student in modern Russian and East European history at KU. Her dissertation is called The Art of Justice, Holocaust Memory and Retribution in People's Poland and Soviet Lithuania, 1944-69. She has received a Fulbright Fellowship and Title VIII American Council's research grant. Her article, Soviet Holocaust Retribution in Lithuania, 1944-64, appeared in the Soviet and Post-Soviet Review in February 2019. Thank you for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. So today I'm going to be talking about my research, which is on Holocaust justice and memory in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. And I compare artistic responses to the Holocaust with legal trials against perpetrators in Poland and Lithuania from 1944 to 1969. Poland and the Soviet Union tried to reconfigure their laws to account for the Holocaust, and this made them able to quite efficiently prosecute genocide. But even so, this could still not adequately account for the people who were not perpetrators in a legal sense, but who were nonetheless participants in the mechanism of genocide. In the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, many Jews had not died in the death camps or concentration camps, but primarily during mass shootings that were carried out by local collaborationist units, and also the denunciation of Jews in hiding was quite common. The diverse array of perspectives in these two source bases, artistic and legal, represented deeper structural grappling with the questions: who was killed, who has killed, and what to do with those who killed. So many of the artists I examine, and this is a term I use broadly to cover poets, writers, visual artists, composers, and playwrights, in their commemorative works navigated the familiar genres of revenge, despair, ambivalence, denial, understanding, hope, diagnosis, and prognosis. And especially the Jewish creators expressed desire that the navigation of one's multiple identities, in their cases Polish, Lithuanian, Ukrainian, Jewish, Soviet, socialist, religious, need not be such a labyrinth. So this is a photograph captured by Kino Chronica on the day of Soviet liberation of Vilnius from Nazi occupation, and I don't know who the photographer is. But we can see that the caption identifies the men only as fascists, with no ethnic descriptor. Who are the men? Germans, we might presume, with Lithuanians among them, and in Vilnius, maybe even Poles. Maybe in this picture they are all German. Somebody who knows more than me might be able to do analysis and discern. But that the caption leaves out ethnicity is important. On the one hand, this reinforces a clear binary between Soviets and fascists. But it also reflects the ambiguities of prosecuting the Holocaust, where local participation in the violence had been so instrumental. And this is a still from the 1963 film The Passenger, Pasażierka, by the Polish-Jewish filmmaker Andrzej Munk. The Passenger was a novel written first by Polish writer Zofia Posmisz in 1956. The plot is based on her own experience as a Polish political prisoner in Auschwitz. In the novel, based upon her original radio play, a German woman named Lisa takes a transatlantic voyage with her husband, a West German diplomat. We learn that Lisa had been an SS guard in Auschwitz when she sees a woman on the ship who looks like the Polish political prisoner Marta, pictured here. Lisa confesses to her husband that she had been in the SS and that she had sent Marta to the gas chamber. But now when she sees this woman who looks like her victim, she must confront her past. In the film, although the story is narrated through the experiences of a German SS officer and her non-Jewish prisoner, Munk stylistically marked Auschwitz as a Jewish space by panning across Stars of David on the clothing confiscated of prisoners and hairbrushes, and then pans back to the stars. And I don't think I included oh, I did. Okay, good. So we have the clothing, and he marks this clothing as belonging to Jews, and then he pans across more clothing, more possessions, and he pans back to the stars. And then he pans across Judaica, a tallit, prayer shawl, menorahs. So he marks the space as a particularly Jewish space. And then in the other scenes in which the children are led to the gas chamber, and there are 3 such scenes in the film, they're particularly marked with Stars of David. Highly successful in Poland, Postmish's novel was made into a television series and into this film by Andrzej Munk. Then, in 1967, Mieczysław Weinberg adapted the novel into an opera, and the libretto to it was written by Dmitry Medvedev. Maybe not Dmitry, that could be, I think that's the Medvedev. And Weinberg was a Polish Jewish composer who fled to the Soviet Union in 1943. His family had died in the Holocaust and in the Soviet Union, where he lived since 1943, and he didn't return to Poland until the late 1960s. He spent his time composing many commemorative pieces on the war and Holocaust, and also pre-war Polish and Jewish life in Poland, particularly Warsaw. And those of you in this room might also recognize his music from the Soviet version of Winnie Pooh. But the 1968 opera, which was set to be staged in Yekaterinburg and also at the Bolshoi, was censored in the end, and it was staged only for the first time in 2006. Later in the talk, I'll be returning to The Passenger to compare some of the artistic discourses from the film, opera, and novel with those emanating in the legal trials. And I'll try to make sense of the two different trajectories of The Passenger as a reflection of politics, but also of the deeper structural reckoning with guilt in post-war Europe. In the broader comparison of source bases, geographies, regimes, and legal systems, we can see the limits and possibilities of what it is that art can do and what law can do. In the late 19th century, the legal scholar Ernest Huffcut wrote that it is a fact too often forgotten that law touches at some point upon every conceivable human interest, and that its study is perhaps, above all others, precisely the one which leads straight to the humanities. In her own study of literature and the law in the Russian historical context, Harriet Murov challenged one of the main premises of the law and humanities movement, which is that victims want their complaints to be heard by the law only and not in some other venue. In her 1998 Russia's Legal Fictions, she said, "We are looking for new legal idioms to express the complaints that present legal language obscures or even condones." But she also asked the implications and costs of moving toward more and more law. But just on Monday, in the New York Review of Books, journalist Lili Lufbaro criticized the anemic optimism of the belief in what she says that dossiers, cases, facts showing wrongdoing by power brokers matter. That if only the truth is recorded, exposed, and circulated, that consequences will be meted out and power will crumble. Communist regimes were obviously known for their cases, their dossiers, their information collecting, which they often used for the purpose of incriminating. In the 1950s and 1960s, resentment had been building among Soviet and Polish authorities over the American staffing of former Nazis in the ranks of the West German Federal Intelligence Service. The Soviet Union also particularly resented the role of the Baltic diaspora press in anti-communist propaganda, and the West's welcoming of nationalists who had been part of the anti-Soviet resistance. Lithuanians in the US had been particularly active in lobbying US Congress and the United Nations to classify Soviet deportations as genocide. The Soviet Union, which carefully monitored the Western and diaspora press, resented that the deportations were being evoked as equivalent to German policies, especially by the representatives of national groups whose anti-Soviet resistors had played such a major role in them. One writer and playwright I examine is Jankev Josada, Jokubas Josada, who was a Litvak, a Lithuanian Jew, and I'll be talking about his work later. He was a member of the Soviet Lithuanian Writers' Union, but was more known for his literary criticism than his own content, much of which became more and more dedicated to the history and fate of Lithuania's Jews. On his identity as a Jew and a Lithuanian and a Soviet and a religious person, Josada at the end of his life said, It wasn't so much a life of paradoxes, but a labyrinth of navigation. His whole family had been killed during the Holocaust, and during the first Soviet occupation of Lithuania in 1940, his own family was on the deportation list. But Josada had been able to use his party connections to get them taken off the list. And after the Holocaust, he would always feel guilty about this because, as he put it, in Siberia, they might have survived. After the war, he apparently found out who had been responsible for killing his own father, but he never took him to court. I've been told that the reason for this was that the man had cancer, and so Josada viewed that this was some sort of divine punishment enough. He also said that Josada thought Jews should forgive their Lithuanian neighbors with whom they'd lived for so long. But he also had been of the view that retribution is not always necessary, that it is more important to understand the crime. So in an interview, he was asked, well, isn't it revolting to dig around in the soul of the monster who killed your father? And Josada replied, it's a typical job for a writer. Regardless of the gravity of the crime, you have to understand it. The principle of double vision is natural in art, not like in real life, he said. But most people in real life are not writers, and in real life, it is still legal systems where we keep looking for guidance in crime prevention. In real life, among the attempts of various states to prosecute participants in the genocide of the Jews, Soviet Lithuania was rather efficient. And the independent Lithuanian state today has actually recognized this in many cases. I want to look at the example of one case, Leonas Kybartas, who in 1945 was arrested for joining the Lithuanian white bands and participating in arrests and beating Jews during mass shootings. He had only stayed in the white bands for 2 months, only during the shootings. And then he quit and didn't join any more resistance. He was sentenced to 15 years of hard labor and confiscation of property. In 1955, after the amnesty for collaborators, releasing those, except for those who had participated in tortures, Kybartas wrote an appeal for release. He wrote, I didn't participate in the annihilation of Jews. During what the surviving Jew was talking about in the deposition during his trial in 1945. During what the surviving Jew was talking about, I was on guard, but the Jews who were annihilated were done so in a different spot, about 5 kilometers away. He had also learned the genre. During the bourgeois times, our family was called godless Bolsheviks. And he said, I've never been an enemy of the people because I'm from a family of workers. His appeal was denied. But then 3 months later, he tried again and sent it this time to Moscow. This time he wrote, I've always disagreed with this harsh sentence because I'm not an especially important criminal, and I didn't commit any grave crimes, and I don't deserve such a great sentence. My crimes, if we can call them that, occurred without bad will or evil initiatives on my part, due to the abnormal state of wartime. What happened with me in 1941, it was all by chance. There was never any bad will or evil motive. It was the wartime, and we, ordinary people, were under conditions of unrestricted war elements and fear. When nobody follows the laws, when the will, wishes, and the very individual personality has no meaning. Therefore, my guilt, where it may exist, is factually without meaning. And anyway, I've had to live the life of a poor, illiterate person in such a horrible time. So he obviously was not writing his own appeal, but was dictating his responses to somebody who was crafting the appeal for him. He goes on, there were 800 people like me in my town, and many of them really participated in this or in something else and received lesser sentences or haven't been brought to responsibility at all. And here I am, I've been sentenced like a big criminal. Well, whoever was reading Hannah Arendt and helping this illiterate Kibartas did a pretty good job, because it was approved and he was home in Tel Shay by 1956, having served only 11 years of his sentence. I was being a bit facetious. I'm not actually suggesting that the person who was helping him with craft the Jalaba was also reading Hannah Arendt. But I wanted to point out the deeper structural grapplings and discourses that are developing in very different contexts. Although maybe he was reading the newspaper too. In 1990, in a series of political reforms, the Soviet Lithuanian government rehabilitated everyone who had been convicted of resisting the Soviet occupational regime, only to then a few years later go back and revoke the rehabilitations of those who had been actual criminals, namely participants in the genocide of the Jews. In 2010, Kibartas' son tried to get the revoked rehabilitation reinstated, and he asked specifically for two things: that Kibartas be named as, one, a non-participant in the genocide of the Jews, and then two, a victim of the occupational regime, of the Soviet occupational regime. The Lithuanian court in 2010 did not approve his request. And so now I want to turn to a fictional trial. Most of you probably don't know this, but on April 16th, 1969, Hitler was also put on trial for war crimes in Buchberg, Germany. The world was gripped by sensation when in 1966, Hitler and his wife Eva Braun had been found hiding out as pensioners in a small little town in West Germany. Hitler was charged with many murders, both precedented and unprecedented, inciting war, war crimes, and a host of other crimes. And he pleaded not guilty. He said, "I only wanted what was good for Germany. I wanted to give her freedom and prosperity. That's why I started this purported campaign against the Jews, and it was so successful, so that proves that I was right." The lawyers at the trial reasoned, well, true, he had started this anti-Semitic campaign much earlier, but this was for tactical reasons. Even more, nobody could prove that Hitler himself did any crimes. In the opinion of the defense, it's the people who are guilty, who supported the National Socialist regime of their own free will. And at any rate, no concrete facts were proven concerning Hitler's participation in atrocities. And since the trial was conducted according to the highest standards of justice, his plea was upheld. The judge assured the shocked public that the ruling was actually a triumph against the state of injustice. So, of course, this is fictional. This satirical imagining of a post-war criminal trial against an unmasked Hitler is from a pamphlet written by German humorist and human rights activist Felix Rexhausen in 1965. Rexhausen was a citizen of West Germany, and he was one of the founders of Germany's Amnesty International. His pamphlet was a satirical indictment of the West German trials in Frankfurt am Main from 1963 to 1965 against high-ranking members of the SS, and this was known as the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials. These high-profile trials brought special attention of the Holocaust to the German public, but were criticized by by the likes of Rexhausen for the way in which the judges had reconfigured the boundaries of responsibility for murder and genocide. Rexhausen criticized the logic of the trials, which had seen most of the officers acquitted or given the lesser charge of abetting murder, by inverting its rhetoric to illustrate a hypothetical, if on the horizon, future acquittal of a Hitler who had not himself committed any crimes. Rexhausen's article actually appeared in 1965 in Soviet Lithuania's main arts and cultural journal, Švyturys. Rexhausen was among a group of non-Stalinist socialists in West Germany, and he was an outspoken critic of all forms of totalitarianism. He was palatable for Soviet audiences because of his belonging in circles who were critical of the grip of anti-communism on the West, and because of his attention to the plight of political prisoners in non-communist states. The historian Laura Wildenthal has described him as dedicated to criticizing the self-satisfaction of newly prosperous West Germans who had not yet put enough distance between the Nazi era and their own political habits of thought, which was illustrated, in his view, by the anti-communist fervor. Rexhausen was also a very vocal advocate of gay rights, and his criticism of the totalitarian treatment of political prisoners was not meant to absolve Soviets, but rather to condemn similar practices in West Germany. So that the cultural press in a Soviet republic would evoke his politics reflected the Soviet Union's eagerness to support anything that could, of course, expose the hypocrisy of the West. But this was informed by years of their own, usually closed and private, investigations into the meaning of personal participation in violence, particularly during the Holocaust, which had anticipated similar debates in the Eichmann trial and the Auschwitz-Frankfurt trials. The internal dynamics of Holocaust justice and representation in Poland and Lithuania after the war reflected the changing relationships between communist Europe and the West in the ebbs and flows of Cold War politics, during which the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948 and West Germany in 1949 were critical moments. In welcoming East Germany into the socialist bloc, the Soviet Union avoided evoking the guilt of the German people, but could take the opportunity to criticize West Germany and the West more broadly for not having sufficiently undergone denazification. As our colleague David Schneer presented to us a few weeks ago, the 1950s and 1960s, in the build-up toward the 20th anniversary of the end of the war, reflected what he said, a universal meditation on war and the consequences of the Holocaust, whereby the Soviet Union projected a diplomatic image to be sent to the world of the wartime suffering wrought by Nazi occupation as a testament for the Soviet Union as the best guarantor of the post-war peace. Schneer shows how this era was, for many Jewish artists, particularly photojournalists, an opportunity to return to their archive and to revisit the material that had meant the most to them. And in this example from the May 9th edition of the 1965 Schwytzeries, the most interesting photo from my album. And here we have the framing of a reader's response from the engineer Krechmeris. And he writes, "Maybe the Hitlerites shot my father with these guns." The second wave of Holocaust justice in the 1950s and 1960s was an answer to the Jews that yes. The memory and representation wave of the 1960s was a transnational moment of clarification regarding the question, what exactly had happened to the Jews? In the late 1950s and 1960s, Soviet security was collecting information on the desire of many Soviet Jews who increasingly began to feel that their own bright future might lie elsewhere, namely Israel. And so, public prosecutions of bourgeois nationalists was a timely message of, we have information, in a renewed effort at visible justice, as the main organizers were either dying or getting lesser sentences in the West. In contrast, in 1965, and in direct response to the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials, the Ministry of Justice in Poland decided against a renewed search for its own collaborators. Minister of Justice Rybicki opposed a new wave because, as he said, to concentrate now on such cases while in Germany the most important criminals enjoy no punishment would be wrong. But if we really want to see how Poland legally confronted the Holocaust, we shouldn't look to the retroactive trials, but rather to post-war legal innovations for the future. And particularly, I mean, the small criminal code decree of June 13th, 1946, which was issued for law on the protection of state economy, social progress, and the fight against the demoralization of the clerical apparatus. Of particular interest is the third of 3 points describing the legislative success of the decree, which Poland's leading prosecutor, Jerzy Sawicki, who had been a survivor of the Lviv ghetto, described as having filled in some of the gaps in the current legislation which, for example, did not have provisions for punishing nationalist, racial, and religious dissensions. And he also pointed out in a meeting with a French jurist, Marc Ansel, in 1946, that certain changes were conceived in response to the consequences of wartime racial violence against Jews, and that this was also intended in order to stop its post-war manifestations. So the Soviet Union took advantage of the opportunity to publicly associate the bourgeois nationalists with the Holocaust and the capitalist West. Soviet authorities, however, correctly pinned the connection between nationalist resistance movements in the Baltics and the genocide of the Jews and emphasized this in the public. But the authorities were less sure how to proceed with perpetrators and individuals whose motives did not clearly align with those of the nationalists. For example, I needed a job, I felt compelled, I was angry, there were no rules, they gave us some vodka. Soviet administration usually, however, opted to punish them, but quietly, and usually not as severely. Now I want to transition from issues of justice to those of memory and commemoration. Dancing is one of the most common tropes of post-war memory. We're familiar with the phrase, the first thing people want to do when the war ends is dance. Soviet surveillance in Lithuania recorded an overheard statement. The Stalin government wasn't afraid of anything, but now the government is afraid of the US, how they play, and how they dance. So, on the theme of dancing, in 1965, the Soviet Jewish artist from Ukraine, Zernovy Tolkachov, entered a contest for the design of the monument at Babi Yar. I see the ambivalence of two possible narratives in this. One, Jews used to dance, they used to be here, but now they are in the pits of Babi Yar and Panar and others throughout Eastern Europe. But there's another narrative that I think is more likely. We dance now, but we still remember the past. This seems to me a direct challenge to the perception that in the West, particularly the newly prosperous West Germany, they dance, but they have forgotten. So now I want to return to The Passenger, where many scenes in the novel and opera, and no, not film, feature Eliza who dances with her husband, alternating between fear that Marta will recognize her, which will countenance a recalling of the truth, and then reassurances that her past is behind her. We actually do not see these scenes in the film because Andrzej Monk died in a car crash before he could complete the film. The only live acting we see is, in fact, her past at Auschwitz and with Marta. So the film goes back and forth between the live action and then a series of stills. In the book and in the opera, however, we do get the motivations. But the main difference is that in the novel, much of this accounting takes place between Lisa's West German diplomat husband and an American he meets on the ship. And the topic of debate is the guilt of the German people. The American Mr. Bradley clarifies, I'm talking about consent to atrocity. I didn't have in mind the disposition of the German people during Hitler's regime. But Walter then asks him, why then have Americans ushered in yesterday's missionaries and knights in the anti-Hitler crusade into the service of the new order, the anti-communist order? But in his private encounters with Lisa, he confronts. Lisa says, "I'm no more guilty today than yesterday. I'm not guilty in general. I was only a good supervisor," he intervenes. "You carried out your honest patriotic duty. I wanted to be a good German, like you want to be a good German. You don't see any difference?" In the opera, the political failures of denazification and the plotline with the American and issues of the West in general are excluded. The accounting remains between Lisa and Walter and the dead. And this was probably a factor of the differences in the genre of staged musical, but it is an important political context to note in why it eventually wouldn't have been successful in the Soviet Union, which for the most public manifestations of art did need this political message. And I want now to draw attention to the rhetoric of personal participation. But don't you imagine that I took part in all the brutal horrors of Auschwitz? Keep talking. I never once took part in beating anyone. I did all I could to help her. Do I understand you correctly? If a torrent sweeps a matchstick into the abyss, it is the matchstick that is guilty? Have you really told me everything? And then the chorus. Confess it all. Confess it all. I've told you everything. No, there's more to tell. There's more to tell. Let the others speak. This accounting between lovers resembles a similar accounting described by Yankev Yosada in his 1965 play Sarah and Rokas, which is about a Lithuanian nationalist and a Jewish woman who fall in love in 1940. Sarah's family is killed in the Holocaust by a nationalist unit that Rokas had been a part of. This version remained unpublished but was the basis of one of his plays, The Silence Syndrome, which was published in 1990. Rokas says, Rokas says, "I didn't shoot. On the contrary, I condemned the murderers." And Sarah says, "You didn't kill, but still you killed." So far, I've tried to address several overarching themes in my research. Local trials against Holocaust collaborators, closed to the public amid the Cold War ebbs and flows of justice, visions of a post-war Jewish future, and the problems of determining degrees of guilt between Hitler and everyone else. Lastly, like in Germany, the Soviet Union also had a generational reckoning between parents and children. And we can see this in the example of the poem I Don't Want by Vytautas Bloža in 1962, who was not Jewish. This poem, as far as I can tell, appears to have not been published, but it did resemble, I think, a later song by Yevtushenko called While the Murderers Walk the Earth. He was widely published for everything else he wrote, like odes to socialism and similar genres. But then when he became critical of the regime, he was actually sentenced to psychiatric treatment. And about those who killed, how to deal with those who killed. I'm asking, what am I supposed to do with those who killed? In this poem, Bloža struggles how to deal with those who participated in killings, but not as fighters for a bourgeois Lithuanian nation, but as people similar to his own mother who, quote, bought flour and salt from the Jewish women who were killed. And in the aftermath, he asserts, I do not want them to buy flour and salt. Bloža was 14 at the end of the Nazi occupation. The next generation had begun to question the wider sense of responsibility beyond the court of law. In the final fragments of the Passenger film, Monk asks, anyway, what is this recollection of a game between overseer and chosen prisoner, from cruelty and evil only to human? The brush with the past did not last long. Lisa won't be challenged by truths buried in the mud of Auschwitz, indifferent to yesterday's crimes, who even today. Superficially, this alludes to the German officers who, in 1963, walked free or got away with lesser sentences at the Frankfurt-Auschwitz trials. But beyond parents, and beyond the Germans, and beyond Hitler, and beyond the nationalists, and beyond Kibartis and other individuals, and beyond the Poles, and beyond the Lithuanians, Munch has turned the victim's gaze onto the future viewer and demanded us not to be indifferent to the fate of others. And this was the central question that many jurists and many artists dealt with, most particularly in the aftermath of the Holocaust. The indifference of others and the actions that people took that they didn't have to take. So to conclude, my research on artistic and legal responses to the Holocaust exemplifies how individuals and state actors in the past have approached the question of what to do when in the free marketplace of ideas, the best ones do not always win out. When legal systems gave the issue a try, it became evident that the imperatives of Western liberalism had the consequences of exonerating those whose role in the perpetration of genocide was to strictly lay down the ideas and the institutional structures, but not to carry out any of the actual acts of violence. The different approach to free speech in the Soviet Union and communist Eastern Europe held that harmful ideas could, for a while and in certain conditions, prosper, and that the people who succumbed to them were not deranged, were not crazy, were not monsters, were not psychologically unfit. Perhaps they had, though, not been properly socialized under communism, or they were susceptible to demonstrably bad ideas by virtue of class or social category. But they were not crazy. Unlike the dissidents, like Bloja, who criticized communist ideas and their brutal methods of selling them, people who participated in crimes against Jews were never sentenced to one of the most infamous methods of Soviet treatment of enemies, psychiatric rehabilitation. So in the end, the Polish and Soviet governments expanded the definition of participation in violence and in the violence that ordinary men and women had not necessarily committed with their own hands. But even so, this could not fully account for the indifference that was all too human. Thank you.
Are there any questions?
Yeah, thank you, Alana, for your presentation. And I'm struck by a couple of things, and I have sort of two big questions for you that I don't expect you to answer authoritatively, but I just want you to think about a little bit. So one of the things that's most interesting about your project is that you're bringing together law and art, right? So legal cases and processes and artistic processes. And I'm not sure if that, the way you divide those as sort of real life versus representation is necessarily, I just want to question that a little bit, because I think there's such a performative quality to law and to trials. Certainly there's the show trials, which are what you're talking about are more secret trials. But there are Soviet show trials. There's the Nuremberg process, which is an international event that has grabbing all sorts of headlines, as does the Eichmann trial. There's the sort of intrinsic drama of the courtroom, which we can see, like any sort of the Law and Order spin-offs, right? This is like there's this, and then there's the performance also of this this particular Lithuanian person, although illiterate, very much sort of characterizing himself in a way that's legible to the regime, even if he can't write, as sort of the son of workers. And so there is a performative quality to law that I think makes it, perhaps it's an authorized representation of real life. I don't think it's necessarily real life itself. And so I wonder if you might sort of play with that idea a little bit and sort of blur the boundary between law and representation. And then the second one, I'm kind of wondering about differences between the Polish and Lithuanian cases. You kind of brought them together, and I certainly see a lot of overlap, but you alluded to a few differences, and one was in 1965 where Poland decides not to continue prosecutions. And so I'm wondering if you can speak to some of the differences and why in particular you think they made that decision.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So for the first question about your comment on the performative quality to law, and that it's often an authorized representation of real life, but not real life itself. I agree, and I think I didn't convey that. But however, many people, ordinary people, they do make that distinction, and so it's hard for us to develop other venues for redress and for testimony and for justice and for getting one's complaints heard when still in the popular conception, even if it's a false one, there is the idea that that law is tangible, it's real life, and then art is for thinking and postulating and dealing with issues that law can't address. But I definitely need to make that connection more clear. And then on the differences between the Polish and Lithuanian cases, one of the main differences is gender. So in the Soviet Union, this isn't necessarily true for collaborators who worked in a kitchen, they worked in a German kitchen, or they translated, or they had contact with a German soldier or something like that. Then women would be prosecuted for treason. That was more common. But Soviets didn't pursue cases against women who had done more bloody things and who had denounced, who had participated in denunciations or trading clothing, taking Jewish clothing after the shootings that their husbands or brothers had done. Those kinds of things do get prosecuted in Poland, but not really in the Soviet Union, and it's mostly just a reflection of two things: the Soviet approach to karateli, which was a male participant in a shooting battalion. So this was by nature gendered, and by virtue of German policy, which was that in Lithuania, large nationalist battalions of men were used to shoot Jews, and so this was the more common way that Jews were killed, and so this also reflected who is getting prosecuted. But in Poland, there weren't the big nationalist battalions organizing and taking Jews to be shot, but there were individual men or members of individual, like certain units who would individually help arrest or help escort Jews or take property or beat or kill an individual Jew. So in Poland we see a lot of cases of, rather than someone having been tried for participating in a mass shooting of 300 Jews, we see this man was accused of beating 2 Jews or killing 1 Jew. And then also we see a lot of women put on trial for denunciation. And so this is, these are two differences in who's getting prosecuted. So gender. In the Soviet Union, it was more likely, by virtue of ending up in a Soviet court, you would be punished. Whereas in Poland, it was more likely that someone would be prosecuted, but that their appeal for clemency would be approved. So that's a difference. And I think that in Poland there was a bit more fatigue. The Soviet Union just didn't, they went full force. But in the Soviet Union, in Poland, there was more of a fatigue with an eye to what was going on in the West and who is not getting punished in the West. And I think that also there's differences in who is organizing the trials. In Poland, a lot of pre-war lawyers, the civil judiciary was in charge, but in Poland, in the Soviet Union, it took place, they were carried out by like an organized security, the NKVD, the KGB, and then later the Ministry of Justice. So this also affected the outcomes.
How does censorship come into the picture with the artistic sources? Because at least some of the artistic productions that you have shown here were not publicly displayed, they were not published. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
So for me personally, in my analysis, actually the question of whether it was published or whether it stayed in the drawer is not the most important, because I'm interested in the generation of content, and if it was broadcasted union-wide on the front pages of Pravda, and if it remains closed in the drawer, several versions. To me, that question is not so central for my purposes, but it does reflect the differing possibilities for artistic creativity in Poland and the Soviet Union. There was more freedom in Poland there was more artistic independence than there was in the Soviet Union, just in terms of conforming to the ideals of socialist realism, let alone topics of war and Holocaust. And so that's why in Poland we see more of these possibilities that we don't necessarily see in the Soviet Union.
Any other questions? No? Well, thank you very much then. Thanks for being here.